Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming today. And it gives me a great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Sjeng Scheijen, who is a wonderful writer and independent scholar, and he curated several important exhibitions. I'm sure some of you have seen amazing exhibition which he curated at the National Gallery in London 2003, I think, which was dedicated to Russian landscapes. He was also advisor to spectacular exhibition on Diaghilev and Belarus, which took place at the V&A a few years ago, 2009, I think. And he's also a former cultural attaché to Dutch embassy in Moscow. And I'm sure there are a lot more things that we could mention. He also, of course, wrote this amazing biography of Diaghilev, which I hope some of you have read, which is the major biography of Diaghilev, and it's absolutely fascinating. So if you haven't read it yet, please do. And of course, the author of the book we're presenting today, which is absolutely fascinating. And we're going to hear more about it. And I hope you will have a chance to look at the book after the talk and maybe even buy it. So anyway, thank you very much for coming. And over to Sjeng. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I do have a microphone laying here, but I think, seeing you, Natalia, addressing the crowd with that you'll hear me also in the back, right? No problem. Great. Thank you. So that's easier. Thank you very much, Natalia, for inviting me here, for having this whole event organized. It's a great honor to be presenting this at the Courtauld. I'm extremely proud and happy with this book that I've worked for 10 years on. It came out already some years ago in Dutch and in Russian, but I'm extremely happy that there is a wonderful English version right now. And I'm happy to tell something about this great story because I tried to narrate it as an ongoing, almost novelistic story approach because it has these particular qualities, I think. So let's go a bit further. If we think about the avant-garde, and many of you, of course, will know what the term means and what kind of artists are associated with it, then we think of grandiose and revolutionary new forms that were presented in Russia at the beginning of the century, and of course, especially during the revolutionary period. One of these icons of the avant-garde period in the Russian Empire and in the Soviet Union afterwards was Tatlin's tower, officially called the Monument for the Third International. And this title already says something about the association of these artists with the revolutionary movement, because the International was, of course, the movement of international communism, the idea that all nations should be divided under the flag of the great utopian idea of communism. For Tatlin, this tower had all kinds of symbolic meanings, but one of them is that it's a kind of an answer to the Tower of Babel. In the biblical story, obviously, you know that the Tower of Babel was the historical moment where all the people came divided because they came to speak in different languages, and the whole idea of strife of nations and strife of peoples everywhere started. And in this international, and also in this new tower to be built, it was 400 meters high as a projection, so 100 meters higher than the Eiffel Tower, which was the highest edifice at the time. The great debacle, the great disaster of the Tower of Babel should be ended. So it was a grandiose ambition that lay at the core of these artists, grandiose in many, many ways. We'll come to speak of many of the other artists as well, but one thing is extremely important for all of them. It's not so much abstraction, it's not so much the search for new forms in art. It was the idea that art and life should be reunited, and that art should be a part, an organic part of life, and of the whole cosmic experience of being a man at every stage of our life. So the idea that art should be confined to museums and to the art studio, that was completely foreign to them. Art should go to the street, it should be an everyday part of everything you do. There was a creative utopia. And this, of course, connects with utopian thinking that is much older, of course. And so in the 17th and 18th century, the idea of utopian thinking really got started, and you see these ideas of the link between creativity and politics or statehood emerge. So all this was more or less united in Tatlin's great monument. And if you look at it, and also how it was publicized, because Tatlin was a great artist, but he was also a great mythologist, a great fabulist. He loved to invent all kinds of stories around his artworks and spread these stories as if they were the truth. And he managed to accomplish that already in 1920, 1921. In all newspapers in Europe, you see these plans for this great monument of the Third International advocated and reported on as if this was already a reality that was going to be implemented seriously. Was that true? Not completely, as we'll see. But if we think of that connection between the avant-garde artist and the revolution, we come, this notion we see in all kinds of texts repeated, right? So just recently I read in an academic book, that the avant-garde was supported by the Bolshevik state and later on the Soviet Union, and this ended only in, let's say, 1930. Some other texts would say that the support for the avant-garde ended in 1924, when Lenin died. And when I started to research this, I stumbled upon so many contradictory statements, and I already read in newspapers in 1919 and 1920 so much protest against the avant-garde, so much letters by readers or letters by middle management from the Bolshevik party that was clearly opposing the avant-garde and avant-garde artist as a kind of non-communist, non-proletarian art form. So how do we connect these seemingly contradictory tendencies here? And if we look at this, we see four of the main, most important, most famous artists of the avant-garde in the high-ranking positions that they achieved in 1918, just let's say 8 or 10 months after the revolution started. We see Kazimir Malevich, who became chairman of the museum board. And then you must also know that just before the revolution, he wrote texts in which he said, that all museums should be bombed and closed, and that all the culture of the past, should be thrown overboard of the ship of modernity. We see Marc Chagall, who some people would not immediately associate with the avant-garde, and very often see as an artist who was mainly active in France, and of course he was, but immediately after the February Revolution, Chagall went back to the revolutionary state and to Moscow in order to be part of this great event. Wassily Kandinsky, also an artist that you very see often in European museums as German artist born in Moscow. Nothing of the sort, because he lived in Moscow, of course, long before. He went to study there. He studied in Odessa as well. And in 1914, with the start of the First World War, Kandinsky went back to Moscow. So he stayed in Moscow at the height of all revolutionary activity for many years, and he was at many stages involved in those revolutionary activities. And Vladimir Tatlin, maybe the lesser known of the four, as a name at least, who built this great Tatlin Tower, who became chairman of the art section in the Ministry of Enlightenment in the Moscow section. But Moscow, of course, being the new capital, was the most powerful place to be. So of all of them, I think at a very short stage, Tatlin was the most powerful of them all. But we also know, as I said before, that there was a lot of protest against the avant-garde. There was a lot of people who did not like at all that these people were involved in the revolutionary movement and had these high-ranking positions in the new government. And that's also quite understandable, because if we look at what I would say Lenin's taste, we see something completely different. Lenin didn't like these artists at all. It was very, very foreign to him. And the kind of art that he liked and that he promoted was something completely different, was the kind of art that was popular in Russia at the end of the 19th century. So realist art. And one particular artist that he promoted was Isaac Brodsky, who was a brilliant pupil of Ilya Repin. But as I said, an artist very much rooted in the 19th century. Many of these pictures have become very well known because they are copied often. So the picture here on the left with Lenin in Smolny is a very often reproduced painting. The first painting here on the left upstairs is the first portrait ever made by Lenin. So Lenin let Brodsky in and made him already quite immediately after the revolution, made him into a kind of court painter. And this enormous work, and you see Brodsky standing there in the corner, so that gives a kind of an idea of the scale of that work, was made just after Lenin's death, when the kind of leader cult about Lenin was starting already. So how do we connect these two completely different ideas of the role of art and how art was appreciated by the Bolsheviks? The pivotal figure within this whole question is this particular man, Anatoly Lunacharsky, who was Commissar of Enlightenment, a kind of new ministry for both education and the arts. He was a very intelligent man, a learned man, and creative man. He was a writer himself. He wrote many plays. He wrote philosophical books, political treatises. He was a brilliant speaker, much better than Lenin, for example. He was well connected with the whole arts world, but especially the older generations. And it's very important to know when we think about the revolution, especially about the Bolsheviks, that we need to understand that many years before the revolution started, they were living in Europe, and they were all exiles. So they lost a lot of connection with what was going on in the big cities in the Russian Empire. So, and that counted for Lunacharsky as well. When he came back, just after the February Revolution, and started to get involved in the revolutionary movement within the Bolshevik Party, he was amazed about these new revolutionary artists, and he could absolutely not follow what they did. He thought of Kandinsky, he wrote this already in 1913, as a complete madman, a man who was on the brink of bestiality, quote unquote. Chagall was, in his view, also, you know, a childish figure, not to be taken really seriously. The kind of art that he really liked was the art of the earlier generation, of symbolism and of impressionism. You know, that was what he considered to be the most progressive art forms, and the art of the avant-garde, you know, was you know, it was noise in a way for him, nothing more. So how do we connect those dots? How is it possible that this man, only 8 or 9 months after the revolution, connected with these strange bestial artists and lured them into the new Bolshevik apparatus? And let's go back to the artist once more to make it a bit more complex, because there's so much to say about them, and we often, maybe too easily, take them as a group. Firstly, their cultural, ethnic backgrounds were extremely different. Although the avant-garde always presented itself as a very international movement, and I think that's very right to do so. We always need to keep that in mind, that they identified as international figures, although they sometimes were very provincial in their outlook, or they didn't speak any languages beyond Russian for some of them. They thought of themselves as world artists. But still, their backgrounds were very, very different. And with the exception of Kandinsky, none of them were from one of the big cities. Malevich was born near Kiev and had a Polish and Ukrainian background. Marc Chagall was Jewish and Belarusian. Kandinsky, although from kind of a different social background than the others, not from poverty, he was from a very wealthy family, very highly educated as a lawyer, actually. He was from Moscow, but educated in Odessa, and had been living for many years in Germany. So still before the war, he was living in Munich for many years. And he was also the only one, maybe with Chagall, but Kandinsky had already a very serious and big international reputation. And Tatlin, identifying himself as Russian, but also born in Ukraine. And this counts for many of these artists, that they have a very diverse, mixed cultural background. A lot of women were part of this movement, if we can call it a movement. And it is something that is published a lot, but still most of these women don't have the reputation that the men have. And maybe with the exception of Natalia Goncharova, who is very well represented in Western museums, the others are far less well known, especially because their works are so less represented in Western museums. Also sometimes they died very early, like Rozanova, who was a very daring and inventive artist, but she died very young. Popova relatively also. But this fact also reflected, of course, the revolutionary background of this whole group. Because, of course, feminism and the liberation of women was an important point of agenda in communism. But let's go a bit deeper in what were these artists and why did they attract so much controversy. This is a publication photograph that was made for a famous exhibition held in Petrograd just before the war and also during the war. And we see Malevich here on the right, another composer, cum artist, very important figure, theorist Mikhail Matyushin, and the sound poet Alexei Krychonych, in this wonderful setting with, you know, chairs upside down, and if you look at the upside of the picture, you see a grand piano, but also upside down. So this is a Dada-esque picture, and this was how these artists officially wanted to publicize themselves. Clownesque, carnivalesque. How do we, again, connect that particular identity with officialdom? Here we see Tatlin, who hired, or was hired, I should say, as a living exponat, a living part of an exhibition, as a blind Ukrainian bandura player in a 1913 traveling exhibition, which was in Berlin, with ethnographic arts. No problem. This is also a bit of a unexpected position, right? So the famous thinker and creator of the big monument for the Third International was also a kind of an artist who made these playful presentations in exhibitions, and later on he used his musical gift, which was very serious, when teaching also. So it was also a part of his identity, but an unexpected one. And he made these instruments himself. He made the clothing himself. So it was, again, one of these signs that for these artists, art was absolutely not confined to the studio and to the museum, and that art should be connected with life in every sense of the word. I also gave a lot of attention to all kinds of strange side figures within the avant-garde, because I think they give a lot of flavor and more insight to what the avant-garde really was. And again, we see queer, strange, carnivalesque manifestations happening, and this all happened before the revolution, obviously, but also later on. Some of these people were active still. We see Vladimir Goldschmidt, completely forgotten figure, but so extreme in many ways that I gave him a role in my book, because he did all kinds of stunts. He presented himself as the first Russian yogi, but he also did public hypnosis seances, and there were all kinds of weird stories going around about this particular artist and poet, that he would hypnotize a chicken or hypnotized a whole band of soldiers. He did all kinds of acts of public nudism, and of course he was arrested for that. He gave these public performances in which he, with his head, like in a kind of Yuuchi performance, would break enormous blocks of rock and wood. He did performances with sound poetry, etc., etc., and they all called it immaterial art. The artist here on the right is Sofia Dimshit-Tolstaya, and she also participated in some of these performances. She performed in the public nudity performances, and later on, after the revolution, she became the secretary of the International Bureau of the Museum Foundation within the government. So again, how can we connect these weird, strange, carnivalesque people with their obviously extremely provocative performances with officialdom and the Bolshevik Party? Here are some of the other public performances that they did with painted faces. They walked around the streets, and this again led to all kinds of wonderful disturbances, the public became wild, they tried to attack these artists, there were columns written in the newspaper about it, and etc., etc. So they loved to do that, of course, it was, all the provocation was part of what they were doing, but it also had a more serious side, again, of the idea of art going to the streets. I think you can talk about what kind of avant-garde lifestyle, which was provocative, Bohemian, but it was also always a kind of group atmosphere. People were living together, they mostly were extremely poor, they almost never sold any paintings. So they had to put up with each other very often, but it was a very collective movement in that sense, but there was also a lot of internal strife. And all that was, I think, also part of this avant-garde lifestyle. So, back to 1918. What happened that Lunacharsky, who was a serious intellectual, who had great responsibilities within the Bolshevik party, who also was a very ambitious and serious politician, so certainly not somebody who, even in that particular circumstance of the revolution, was, you know, trying to take all kinds of risks. What did him make to invite these particular artists in order to take in those positions? When the Bolsheviks came in, as I said before, they had more or less lost their connections with the art world and with many parts of the world. So they found themselves in October 1917 in power, but they were confronted with a lot of problems, a lot of sabotage from civil servants, and they had to, you know, counter all of the political strife, because the Bolsheviks were a relatively small party, as you maybe remember. So they had enormous problems in implementing their political agenda. And this counted also for Lunacharsky. He was continuously having problems with the middle management in all the cultural institutions, who were just closing the door and, you know, wiping the keys away, who were closing down the heating so that, you know, nobody could work anymore. So Lunacharsky had an enormous problem. Still, he didn't want to invite the avant-garde. And they actually were the only artists who were really enthusiastic about the revolution, because it obviously connected with their own ideas of a complete overhaul of life. None of these artists were Bolsheviks. Most of them, if at all, they had some kind of political connection. They were connected with anarchists. So there were all kinds of various revolutionary movements in 1918, and if there was some connection, it was with the anarchists. They had no connection with the Bolsheviks whatsoever. And mostly they were completely uninterested in politics. For them, the revolutionary was a movement, an intellectual and creative overhaul. It was something that, you know, would be much grander actually than a political change of life. So for them, politics was just something, you know, that would follow the much greater idea of a revolution of the mind and of life itself. So they wanted to be connected with what was happening, but with the actual politics, they were very little involved. So this was the situation, let's say, beginning of 1918. And Lunacharsky's first idea, first artist that he went to in order to get support was nobody less than Alexander Benois. And I don't know if you know who that was, but I think many of you will. He was one of Diaghilev's main designers and also one of the people who, together with Diaghilev, made this journal and this artist movement called Mir Искусство, the world of art. But he was a relative conservative. For Benoit, even Impressionism was, you know, a bit of a step too far. He had no taste at all for the early modernist movements that he always and quite fundamentally rejected. And he was a great intellectual, an art critic as well, very influential, an art historian. So he was a man who was very highly regarded and had very influential. But already before the war, he was seen as the most important anti-avant-gardist in the Russian Empire. So Benoit was Lunacharsky's first choice. But Benoit, being a liberal, would not be politically connected with the new government. So he had a problem there. Benoit was doing all kinds of things for Lunacharsky, but he didn't want to be involved politically. Still, Lunacharsky held the avant-gardists away. And it was Mayakovsky, the poet, who was the main broker, you could say, between Lunacharsky and these artists. So Mayakovsky, again and again, he knocked at Lunacharsky's door, and Lunacharsky had at least some sympathy for Mayakovsky. And he was saying, I have these people, and they want to work for you. They want to do, develop your political agenda. But Lunacharsky held him off. But then something happened in mid-1918. Lenin came to Lunacharsky and came to him with a plan. And that later is historicized as Lenin's plan for monumental propaganda. And it means that Lenin wanted that the whole public space in the big cities would be changed. Monuments for the Tsars would be taken down, and new monuments would be erected in order to make the public space into a space for propaganda and education about the new proletarian government. And this needed to be done on a quite, on a short notice. So Lenin expected results quickly. But Lunacharsky had just nobody to take this into his hands. And then, reluctantly, but still, he had no other choice. He went to these artists, and from May 1918, June 1918 on, they became part of the government and took in these positions that we saw at the beginning. And Vladimir Tatlin became especially responsible for the implementation of Lenin's plan of monumental propaganda. So that was an enormous task at hand, but in a way it was quite natural for these artists to do that, because it was bringing art to the streets. It was bringing art into life and connecting immediately with crowds everywhere, outside of the museum and the artist studio. So for them it was an ideal connection to be working with the Bolsheviks, although politically they were very far from them. And it led also to enormous strife within the groups, because they, many of them detested the idea of working with the Bolsheviks, especially Rodchenko, a bit unexpectedly, because he later on became one of the more fervent supporters of the Soviets. But this was still 1918, 1919. Many of the older monuments were taken down, and they had a responsibility to come up with new monuments. And this particular sculpture was the only piece that was erected in that particular period when the avant-garde was at power. It's an enormous concrete edifice, a kind of flame-like futurist or cubist form that more or less represented Bakunin, the great anarchist, made by a sculptor called Boris Karloff. Now, of course, they used concrete, partly also because there was no other material at hand. There was no marble. There was no other, beautiful materials to be working with. But also, concrete was a democratic material, right? It was easy to work with. It was modern. It represented a new world. So a concrete monument it should be. But when this was erected in scaffolding, and Lunacharsky saw it, he immediately rejected it. He said, I'm not going to open this or declare this. And it stood for a few months in scaffolding, and then it was taken down again. And this, in a way, symbolizes the position of the avant-garde. So they tried to work together, but their aesthetics and their ideas were just far too radical for the Bolsheviks. And we remember Lenin's taste. You can understand why the Bolsheviks wanted nothing of the sorts. They wanted recognizable monuments, and Lenin even wrote to Lunacharsky, I want a portrait of a buste of Karl Marx, but with a recognizable beard. The beard is very important. We need to have a good beard, otherwise people will not understand that it's Marx. So it was on this, let's say, a micromanaging level that Lenin was involved. So this was, let's say, the only major event when a real public monument was presented by the avant-garde. But there is something else. So a temporary event in late 1918. And we only have some photographs and some of the designs left. But when we look at this, this was really the moment for the avant-garde when they had, at least for once, the possibility, and it became reality, to completely overhaul public space. This is a design made by Nathan Altman for the celebration of the first anniversary of the October Revolution on Palace Square. And you will know Palace Square, the grand square before the Hermitage. It's enormous in scale, and it should be painted over in a reddish color. The openings to the street on the left will be to Miliona ulica. In the middle, it goes to the Moika River. On the right, there's also under the arch a connection with the rest of the city, and they were all to be connected with enormous suprematist abstract installations. And in the middle of all that, there was this enormous abstract installation made around the Alexander column, which was in a way a kind of a symbol of Tsardom. And this became a reality. We see here some of the other sketches made by Altman. We have a few photographs where you can also see some of the scale of this thing. So this is the actual installation, and this is a human being. So you get an idea of the scale. And here as well, this is an enormous group portrait made in November 1918 at the beginning of the festivities. And what you see on top of that are the enormous abstract plates that were part of the installation, and you see the Alexander column coming out of it. And it looks almost as if this Alexander column is a kind of rocket that is exploding and going up to the stars in a last farewell to Tsardom. So this was something enormous, and it's as a public space artwork, even bigger than the biggest artworks by Christo, for example. So who is always considered as maybe the first who did these gigantic changes in public space. But what happened here in 1918 is both on a scale and also maybe conceptually larger than Christo's later works from the 70s and 80s. Many other things happened. This is from a year later in Vitebsk. A little bit quickly. This is again on Nevsky Prospect. Of course, not all the artists that were participating were radical artists like Malevich or Tatlin or Altman. Some of them were more futuristic or Cuba-futuristic, but still, this was a completely new aesthetic, obviously, for the vast majority of people. And these things wouldn't have been possible, obviously, without the revolution. Here are decorations also on Nevsky Prospect in Petrograd. Then here's some decorations in Moscow. It's a very large one, and actually there are no pictures of that. We only have descriptions from later on. If you know the big square before the Bolshoi Theater with all the many trees, all these trees were packed in a kind of blue canvas. So if you were looking at the trees, and then the trees themselves were painted white. So also here you see this kind of landscape art or public art, art in public space, that we see coming back only maybe in the 70s or 80s later on, but then already implemented on an enormous scale in revolutionary Russia. But this also was more or less the end of the immediate involvement of the avant-gardists, because everything what happened in 1918, it aroused so much negative reactions. So many people were protesting against what happened, and there were all kinds of letters in newspapers and in magazines saying that this is not the art of the people, people will not understand it, we need understandable art for the masses, etc., etc. There was both a political agenda behind that, because also from the top of the Bolshevik party, many people were very disconcerted about what they were seeing, but also it was in a way a grassroots movement. So you can imagine that being confronted with all this new ways of looking and this new aesthetic, that many people protested and didn't see this as worthy of a serious government. And I think, you know, if something like this would have happened in the West, in Amsterdam or in Paris, you would have had the same kind of reactions. It was obviously revolutionary in many ways, so it's not a strange thing in a way that it attracted so much protest. But the role of the avant-garde artist was not completely played out. So, and this is when it becomes historically a bit more complex, that they got some positions in new formed cultural institutions. And when you read about that, it looks, you know, as if that those were very serious, well-funded new institutions. So this is one of the reasons why we have this idea of the avant-garde being supported by the Bolsheviks. But these things were already quite marginal in their public attention that they got, in their funding, but in a from a historical perspective, especially from the art historical perspective, they were extremely important because they provided new models for art museums and art institutions. And if we look at what art institutions do nowadays, there are enormous connections and parallels with what was being done by the avant-gardists at the time. So there was a new institute in Moscow and one in Leningrad. The Leningrad institution was led by Malevich, and in Moscow it was led by various artists, among which Rodchenko and Kandinsky. And they had a program of exhibitions, but especially also of research. What we would nowadays call artistic research, so using the language of art to understand reality better. And this is a truly revolutionary concept as well. And they had the great advantage that they could use many of these palaces, especially this was the case in Leningrad, that were standing empty. So a lot of the nobility, of course, fled the country, but also because the capital moved to Moscow, many of the former buildings that were used by the state were standing empty. So you had this strange city with a lot of empty spaces, and they got hold of one of these great palaces on Isaac Square, where they could have this institution. I'm not really sure, actually, if they were open always. I don't think so, actually. So we must not see them as museums in the modern sense that you could always enter. I think they sometimes had projects and they were open, but most of the time they were closed because their funding was always extremely problematic. I found some letters by Rodchenko, who was asking, for example, for a pair of shoes for his main courier, because he had one man in his service who always was bringing pieces back and forth from collectors or from warehouses to the institution, or doing other type of courier work, but he had no shoes anymore, and this man could not work without his shoes, so he had to apply for a pair of shoes. This was the kind of problems that we were dealing with. They had no typewriters, and if they had typewriters, they didn't have the rolls of ink or whatever you would call them. There were no stamps for mailing, so it was extremely problematic. There was no heating in these palaces at some time, so they were sitting with double winter coats, if they had them, of course, and working. So it was certainly not well-funded institutions. It were more or less places where very marginally they could continue their artistic activity. And this was also in a way the position that they were given. Okay, you are too difficult to deal with. We certainly don't want to have you at a prominent position anymore, but we will not make life completely impossible for you. So you go to these institutions, and you have your life there, and hopefully we don't see you ever again. So that was more or less the position of these institutions. A bit different was another very interesting, this is again Moscow, another institution that also was led by one of the avant-gardists, Kandinsky, which was the Academy of Artistic Sciences. So it's not an art academy, but an Academy of Sciences for the arts, where arts are used as a form of cognition and a form of science. And it's a wonderful organization. At least it was projected as such. You see here the various classes. This is of course in a French translation, but made at the time already. So they had classes of sociology, of physical psychology. There was a very important laboratory for the language of movement, for example, so the choreographers working there as well. And those were connected with all the arts. It's a very, very modern way of thinking about how art should be connected to life again. And also here that we must be aware that It was not an enormous institution, but it was a bit better funded than the earlier two ones, and that mainly is connected with Kandinsky, who was highly educated, who was a lawyer, so he could write policy papers and could defend his position within the bureaucracy better than the other two, so Malevich in Leningrad and Rodchenko in Moscow. So this provides us what I would call the avant-garde paradox. How do we deal with their position within the Bolshevik state and later the Soviet Union? You can imagine that for these artists, they became themselves double-headed in a way, like a double-headed eagle, with regard to the revolutionary state. At one particular point, they were, of course, connected with it because of the revolutionary ideas. They wanted to be part of it. They still were hoping to regain their earlier positions. They were continuously fighting for that. They didn't want to give up, obviously, but many of them, especially maybe the less ambitious ones, were trying to come to some kind of, come to terms with communism and the new demands that the art world was giving them. And those demands were that art should be popular and should be recognizable and understandable, and that the average worker could enjoy it without having all kinds of explanation. So it was a very difficult position that they were in, and it became more and more difficult, although they still had some position in the West, because the Bolsheviks, being savvy propagandists, they understood already quite early that although they didn't want to have these avant-gardists at prominent positions at home, they were great to be advertised in the West. So in the exhibitions that the Soviet Union started to make in Europe, so one of the first is in 1922 in Berlin and later in Amsterdam, and the World Expos in, especially the one in 1925 in Paris, you see a very prominent position for these avant-garde artists. Quite different than their position at home. So they were used for that as well, but even that slowly ended. And when we look at Tatlin's tower, for example, and I started the story with that tower, he presented it, Tatlin again, at one of the fora of the Third International, which was a grand conference organized by the Russians in Moscow, where all communists from all various countries would come together. But maybe you can remember, can understand now that this tower was never an assignment immediately from the Bolshevik Party, although Tatlin said to everybody that it was so. I found the actual contract that Tatlin in the end received of the Commissariat of Enlightenment, which was not signed by Lunacharsky, but by his deputy Sternberg, who was an artist himself and quite close to the avant-garde. And if you look at that contract, you see that this whole project was never originated from the party itself or from the Commissariat. It was really Tatlin's idea, and they only give him permission to make the model. Permission. He was not paid for it. He got no money whatsoever. There was no necessity from the party to do anything before that. He only was given the permission to make it, and if he would need materials, then he should go with that particular paper, that contract, to factories and ask them for the materials, and then they should give it to him. So this was the only privilege he was given in order to make that model. But for Tatlin, being the fabulist that he was, this was enough. And he presented this contract everywhere and showed it as if the party had given him this particular assignment to make this grandiose tower, and that the model that he was making, already also 7 meters high, was just, you know, a first glimpse of the actual tower that also was going to be built. And he presented this as if it was a decision already taken. So, and through all these kind of stories, it ended up in Western newspapers, and there was a whole Tatlin legend was born, you could say, and even artists in Germany, Dadaists, were reacting to that, although they knew almost nothing of Tatlin except for this Tatlin tower. And you see, you know, Western journalists reacting to the machine art of Tatlin, is this right or not? But at the same time, you know, in Russia, it almost didn't happen. He just puts this enormous model, again, in one of the halls of the conference of the Third International. This was also, again, a private initiative. But okay, when it stood there, you know, you couldn't just take it out again. And then at one moment, he tried to present it to Lenin. So this was his important moment. And the idea was that the great blocks that were inside the tower should become ministries and enormous buildings where people were working to propagandize the message of communism to the world. And these blocks were made to rotate according to cosmic, so the movement of the planets and the sun. So the biggest one should rotate in 1 year, the other one in a month, and the other in a week and in a day. So we're 4 of these, maybe, I can do it later on. So, and this, in a way, was a gigantic cosmic clock. And at a certain moment when Lenin came in, and Tatlin had made a kind of mechanism through which he could show the rotating of these massive blocks inside of the tower. And at the moment when Lenin came in, it got stuck. There was one of Tatlin's students who was laying behind it, so under it, because there was a big pedestal under the tower. And, you know, Lenin was there. He was said to be looking at a moving monument. Nothing happened. He just shook his shoulders and went away. And 8 or 9 months later, Tatlin was then working in Leningrad. He heard from friends that people were disassembling his tower and burning the wooden fragments of it in a samovar. If the story is right, I don't know, but this is the story that we have, and it disappeared certainly. And he wrote to Mayakovsky an agitated letter, because Mayakovsky was his great friend. Please try to save my work, because they are, you know, feeding it to the samovar. What really happened, we don't know, but we do know that it disappeared. And it is quite understandable, actually, that it was used as firewood, because in the early years of the revolution, after the revolution, there was an enormous lack of energy and of wood, and everybody was always looking for ways of heating buildings. So it's certainly not a wild idea to think that it ended up in a giant samovar. He made a second version of the tower in 1925, which was presented only at the World Expo in Paris in 1925, and then was sent back to Russia. It ended up at some time in the Russian Museum in Leningrad, and during the blockade also was given to the fire. So it's a symbolic maybe of what happened with the avant-garde, because already in the mid-20s their position became more and more difficult, and I think from 1927 on we can say that their position was really disastrous, because the institutions that they had, they closed down. Some of them still had some positions in existing art academies, but they couldn't exhibit their works anymore, and they also were more and more became victims of repression. And Malevich was arrested for the first time in 1927. He was 3 times arrested, and especially the last time was extremely heavy. And I have serious leads that made me say that he was tortured for a few days at least. And in a way, he never completely recovered from that, and he died in 1935. Tatlin lived longer, but also as a completely marginalized and extremely impoverished figure. So, taking this all together, there was a revolutionary and extraordinary moment when these artists indeed were connected with the revolutionary movement, but it always was a marriage of convenience, if not a marriage of inconvenience. It lasted only for a very short time, and it's only because they were so enormously inspired and so endlessly energetic in what they were doing, and the fact that they just didn't want to give up, and even against all this, these problems that they had, were continuing what they do. That they stayed in some positions at least within the Soviet Union, but actually, when you critically look at it, their position was gone already from 1921, but in the 1930s they in a way completely disappeared. The last works of art that were still hanging in museums were taken down and brought to storages, and they were taken out only later in the 80s. So for at least 50 years the people from the Soviet Union could not see these works of art that have made Russia proud in many ways, of course, because it was the first time, I think, that a broad art movement existed in the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union that was not so much part of a pan-European art movement, really leaded it, really brought something completely new to the art world, and it's the golden age of art in this region. Well, these are again tragic times, of course, and but still we can enjoy it as much as we can, and still the museums are open, and we, even in Putin's Russia, most of the avant-garde works are still on show. So let's hope that it stays that way. Thank you very much for your attention.